The day I met Elvis, he was already a legend, even though he was just a kid. I remember it like it was yesterday. The sun was beating down on Maple Street, and the dust kicked up with every step we took. It was the summer of 1942, and the world was at war, but in Old South Tupelo, life went on as usual. Elvis and his mom, Gladys, had just moved into a small house on Maple Street. I was part of a group of kids we called the Wild Bunch. We were a ragtag group of friends who spent our days getting into all sorts of trouble. I was 8, and Elvis was a year younger, but he seemed a lot older. He was shy at first, but it didn't take long for him to fit in. We were like a family, and he was one of us. One day, we were having a corncob war with another group of kids from down the street. We were just kids, after all, and this was our version of a battle. We'd throw corncobs at each other, laughing and running around. But things got a bit too heated, and Elvis got hit in the back of the head. He had a big knot and he was crying. We all felt bad, but he didn't hold it against us. From that day on, he was a bit more careful, but he never stopped being part of our adventures. We had our own little hideout, a place where we could be ourselves. There was an old abandoned cattle barn on South Green Street, just past Kings Creek Bridge. It was a perfect spot for our chicken raids. We'd chase the wild chickens around, and sometimes we'd catch one. We'd take it down to the creek and try to roast it over an open fire. It was our way of feeling like grown-ups, even if we were just kids. Another time, we decided to play a prank on Officer Kahn, the old police officer who patrolled the streets. We climbed up on top of the old livery stable on North Spring Street and filled balloons with water. We waited for Officer Kahn to walk by, and when he did, we dropped the balloons in front of him. One time, Elvis dropped a balloon too late, and it hit Officer Kahn right on the head. We ran like the wind, and Officer Kahn, being in his 60s, had no chance of catching us. Elvis had a way of making everything fun, but he also had a softer side. He and his mom were really close. Sometimes after school, I'd see him sitting on the porch, waiting for Gladys to come home from the garment factory. They'd talk in a way that made it seem like he was the parent, and she was the child. It was a bit strange, but it was their thing, and I never questioned it. One day, Elvis and I borrowed a guitar from Fred in Jellies. We wanted to serenade a couple of cute sisters we knew. We played a few songs, and the sisters invited us in. Elvis leaned the guitar against a post on the front porch, and forgot about it until a clap of thunder reminded us. It had been raining for a while, and the guitar was filled with water. It was ruined. Elvis promised Mr. Injellies he would pay for it, but he never did. I guess he was just a kid, and kids make mistakes. Life on Maple Street was simple, but it was full of adventures. Elvis was just one of us, but there was something special about him. We didn't know it then, but those days on Maple Street were the beginning of something much bigger. I remember the summer of 1950, when we went back to Tupelo. It was a time of joy and family, but it also had its moments of deep sadness. My Aunt Retha Smith died in a terrible accident when a kerosene can exploded and destroyed her home. It was a devastating blow to our family. I can still picture my mom, Gladys, on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, speaking in tongues or maybe just incoherent words of pain. It was a moment that left a deep mark on all of us. During that same visit, my dad Vernon and I went to a music competition at the Lyric Theater. It was a Thursday night, and the winner of the preliminary round would go on to the final competition. A guy named Wayne Hamilton won with his accordion performance of Are You From Dixie? I sang a slow ballad called Tenderly and played my guitar. Wayne didn't remember me very well, but he did remember winning that night. He even got an electric stove as a prize, which seemed like a strange reward for a teenager, but it was a big deal back then. Despite losing, I didn't let it get me down. I kept moving forward, dreaming of bigger things. My family, on the other hand, was always on the move. We lost our house on Berry Street and had to leave East Tupelo. We moved to a place on the edge of the Shake Rag district, which wasn't a good neighborhood, but it was closer to my dad's job. Then we moved again to a small house on Mulberry Alley. It was a tough time, but we always found ways to help each other out. One of the most memorable moments from my early years was when a film producer came to Tupelo Consolidated School to make a movie about the town. It was the spring of 1946, and I was finishing 5th grade. The producer filmed the students leaving the school, and I remember pausing and looking around before walking out. It was my first time on film, and even though I was just a kid, I felt a little bit like a star. In 6th grade, we put on a Thanksgiving program at Tupelo High School. I played a judge in one skit, and the month of October in another. I brought my guitar to school and sang Old Shep, but not many people remembered it. I was still just a kid trying to find my voice. The year 1947 was relatively calm. My family continued to go to I Assembly of God Church, where Rev. Frank Smith was the pastor. He taught me some basic guitar chords, but I was the one who really took to it. I carried my guitar everywhere and sang whenever I could. My family moved again, this time to a house on Old Highway 45 North near the Rough Dairy Farm. We did some sharecropping there, and then we moved to 1010 North Green Street, an area called The Hill. Living on Green Street was different. It was a mixed neighborhood, and we had indoor plumbing for the first time. I remember walking down Green Street to Gloucester Street, junior high, and going to the Lyric Theater to watch movies. I met my friend Billy Welch there, and we would ride our bikes to each other's houses to practice singing. Billy's family was musical, and we would hide in the back room and sing together. We even picked wild plums and tried to make some money, but it didn't last long. We also picked cotton on my Aunt Lavelle's farm, but we only did it for one day. I spent a lot of time at Janice Davis's house too. Her family owned a grocery store, and they had a piano. I would go there to practice, and sometimes her brother Eugene would join me. There weren't many opportunities to hear black music in Tupelo, but I did listen to a man named Bubba Collins, who played his guitar outside the hotels. It was one of the few times I was exposed to that kind of music. In 7th grade, my mom took me to the library to get a library card. I remember checking out a book about Andrew Jackson. It was probably for a school assignment, but I enjoyed reading it. The library was on the 3rd floor of the city-county building, and it was a special place for me. Those years were full of ups and downs, but they shaped who I became. Even though we moved a lot and faced many challenges, I never stopped dreaming. I kept singing and playing my guitar, and I knew that one day I would make it big. I remember the day I saw the photo of Elvis on a bike. My friend Julian showed it to me, and the first thing I noticed was that the street in the background didn't look like anything in Tupelo. I was confused because the photo was supposed to be from when Elvis was 13, just before his family moved from Tupelo to Memphis, but something didn't add up. Julian told me that the photo was taken in Memphis, not Tupelo. He knew this for sure because he had been involved in tearing down buildings on Jefferson Street in Tupelo, and there were no liquor stores there back in the 1940s. Mississippi was a dry state until 1972, so no one could buy alcohol in Tupelo at that time. I did some digging and found an article on a big Elvis fan website. The writer, David Troadson, had also noticed that the photo didn't match the description given by the Vanity Fair article. He found a photo from around 1955 that showed a perfect match to the background in the Vanity Fair photo, but the location was in Memphis, not Tupelo. In the Memphis photo, you can see a drugstore called S&S on one side of the street, and a liquor store called Milo's across the street. The buildings in the background are the same as in the Elvis photo. The Presley family had actually lived very close to this spot when they first moved to Memphis. They stayed in a small apartment on Washington Avenue and later in a rooming house on Poplar Avenue, which is just a short walk from the drugstore. John Sampietro, whose dad ran the S&S drugstore, remembered Elvis coming in to play pinball. The owner of Milo's liquor store, Milo Salamito, also confirmed that the photo was taken in Memphis. His son, Jerry, even recognized the store in the photo. So, the Vanity Fair photo was actually one of the earliest pictures of Elvis in Memphis, not Tupelo. It's amazing how a small mistake can become a big story, and how people can remember things differently over time. Another interesting story is about Elvis's first marriage. Well, it's more like a rumor. In 1948, when Elvis was 13, there was a marriage license that showed he married a girl named Magdalene Morgan. Some people thought it was a joke, but Magdalene, who everyone called Maggie, had a different story. Maggie and Elvis had been friends since they were little. They both sang in the church choir and played instruments. Maggie said they were always in Christmas plays together, and that they were sweethearts from the 4th grade. They would talk about their dreams and go for walks in the woods behind Elvis's house. Maggie was there when Elvis sang his first song on the radio, and she was so proud of him. When the marriage license came out, Maggie was surprised. Her name was misspelled, and the signature wasn't hers. The license was filled out in pencil, which wasn't how official documents were done. It was also missing the date when it was recorded, so it wasn't a legal document. But the story of Elvis and Maggie's friendship is still a sweet one. There's even a photo of Elvis and a girl that some people say is Maggie, but it's been tampered with. The girl in the photo is shorter than Elvis, and she's dressed for summer, while Elvis is wearing a jacket and gloves, which suggests it was winter. The whole thing is a bit of a mystery, but it shows how much people love to talk about Elvis and his early life. These stories about Elvis's bike and his first marriage show how even small details can get mixed up over time. But they also give us a glimpse into the life of a young Elvis, who was just a regular kid with big dreams before he became a superstar. I still remember the day when Vernon lost his job at LP McCarty and Sons. It was early November, and everything changed in an instant. Vernon came home looking more stressed than I had ever seen him. He told us we needed to pack up and leave Tupelo. It was a shock. We had just moved to a house with indoor plumbing, and things seemed to be going well. But now we were told to grab only the things that mattered most, and get ready to start a new life in Memphis. I was in the 8th grade at Gloucester Street Junior High, and I had made some good friends. The thought of leaving them behind was hard. I tried to act like it was no big deal, but inside I was scared. On my last day at school, I played my guitar and sang for about 30 minutes at a farewell party. I ended with a traditional song called "Leaf on a Tree." It felt like I was saying goodbye to everything I knew. Mrs. Camp, my teacher, always let me sing and play in homeroom and chapel programs. She said I was one of her main characters, but now it was time to leave. People in Tupelo were confused by our sudden move. Some thought Vernon had been caught selling bootleg alcohol. Others said it was because of a forged marriage certificate, and some even suggested Gladys was pregnant. But the truth, as I later found out, was that Vernon had been caught stealing cigarettes from the warehouse. He had been caught 3 times, and Mr. McCarty, the owner, was about to turn him in to the police. Vernon didn't want to go back to prison, so we left. We packed what we could into an old trunk and strapped it to the top of our 1939 Plymouth. The rest of our belongings were sold. It was a tough time. We left behind the life we had built and headed to Memphis, where we knew no one. When we got there, we moved into a rat-infested boarding house on Poplar Avenue. It was a far cry from the comfort of our house in Tupelo. We shared a bathroom with 15 other families, and there was no running water most of the time. The kitchen was a small, dingy room with a community hot plate, but the rent was cheap, only $35 a month. Vernon found a job at United Paint Company, and Gladys worked as a factory seamstress and then as a cafeteria waitress and a nurse's aide. Their combined income was just enough to pay the rent. It was a hard life, and we all felt it. Gladys and I were angry at Vernon for putting us in this situation. We were closer than ever, but it was a bond built on shared frustration. School was a new challenge. I started 8th grade at Christine's school on 3rd Street. The kids there didn't know what to make of me. I spoke with a thick country accent, and my clothes were patched and too short. I told Gladys that no one liked me. I felt invisible. I wanted to be noticed, but I didn't know how. It was a lonely time, but there were some bright spots. Gladys and I started going to the old First Assembly of God Church on East McLemore. The services were like the ones we used to attend in Tupelo, which was comforting. I also began to listen to WDIA, a radio station that played black R&B, country, and inspirational music. The station had a big impact on me. I loved the music, especially when K-Star and Mahalia Jackson were on. I would insist that everyone be quiet so I could listen. In September of 1949, I started 9th grade at Humes High School. It was a big school with 1,600 students, and it was overwhelming. I ran home the first day, feeling scared and out of place, but I knew I had to keep going. I had to find my place in this new world. Memphis was a tough city, but it was where I was going to make my future. I remember the day I finally joined the J. Rock at Humes High. I loved the uniform, but it didn't last long because it took too much time away from my music. I also loved reading, especially history and literature, but my friends didn't get it. So I started reading in private and even brought books on tour, keeping them hidden. The summer before my junior year, I got a job at Precision Tool. It felt good to have my own money to spend on records and clothes. I started frequenting pawn shops and stores on Beale Street, where I discovered Lansky Brothers. The store had the craziest clothes with bright colors and wild patterns. One day I saw a shirt I wanted but didn't have the money. Bernard Lansky, the owner, invited me in, and I told him, "When I get rich, I'll buy you out." He laughed and said, "Don't buy me out, just buy from me." I did, and we became lifelong friends. I started growing my hair longer and slicking it back, just like the black musicians I admired. I even dyed it black. I wore bold, flashy outfits that made people take notice. I didn't care if they thought I looked weird. I wanted to stand out. I worked at Marl Metal Products during my senior year, helping my family and buying more music and clothes. I had a girlfriend named Regis Wilson. We went to prom together, and I wore a dark suit with blue suede shoes. We didn't dance much, but we talked all night. Regis remembered how we posed for a picture in front of a giant red heart. I didn't know how to dance with a partner, but I had my own moves on stage. At school, I became the class clown. I made people laugh, and they started laughing with me, not at me. Some stories say I needed protection from other kids because of my clothes and sideburns, but that wasn't true. I could hold my own. One time, I even knocked a guy back into his bus when he cursed at my friend's coach. Humes had a big variety show every year. One night, I was jamming with Red West and some others. Our music teacher, Coach Phillips, caught us and didn't think much of it, but I knew we were onto something. The 1953 yearbook didn't list me as anything special. I wasn't the cutest, the most popular, or the most talented, but I signed my name Elvis Presley in Gloria Trout's yearbook. She was the most popular girl, and I wrote, "Best of luck to a very pretty girl, remember me, Elvis Presley." In April 1953, I performed at the Humes High Band Minstrel Show. I sang "Keep Them Cold, Icy Fingers Off of Me" and got a standing ovation. I even did an encore. It was a big deal for me, and I felt like I was on my way. But the real turning point came in July 1954 at the Overton Shell. Bob Neal, a radio guy, put me on the bill with Slim Whitman. I was nervous because I was singing a black blues song, "That's All Right Mama," and a country song, "Blue Moon Over Kentucky." The audience paid to hear country music, but I knew I had to do my thing. When I stepped on stage, I adjusted the mic and launched into "That's All Right Mama." I leaped into it, sneered, and the crowd went wild. That night, I knew I had found my sound. Elvis's sudden rise to fame didn't change him much. He still kept in touch with his old friends from Tupelo. One of them, Eugene Ed Christian, shared some personal stories about Elvis's early years in Memphis. Ed and I were like family. Our aunts, Floy May Frost and Gladys, were best friends. They both moved to Memphis around the same time. My Uncle Buster had a job taking care of rental houses, and Aunt Floy and Gladys would visit each other often. After Elvis moved to Graceland, he would send a car to pick up Aunt Floy for lunch or dinner at his place. These visits lasted until Gladys passed away. I lost touch with Elvis after they moved to Memphis, but we ran into each other on a street in Frankfurt, Germany, in the late 1950s. I had joined the Mississippi National Guard, and later transferred to the regular Army. We were both in the 3rd Army, 3rd Armored Division, but in different companies. We talked about old times, but Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, seemed nervous about it and wanted to leave. Years later, in the mid-1960s, I was walking with my friend Richard Hill on North Spring Street in Tupelo when we saw a long black limousine. As we walked by, we heard someone call my name. It was Elvis, half in and half out of the car. He invited me in, and we talked about the good old days. He told me he was in Tupelo to reclaim an iron fence he had given to a park for the children. The fence had gone missing and he was upset about it. Elvis seemed unhappy and empty inside. I asked him how that could be, considering all his fame and money. He replied, "No, the world is on top of me. I'm just a puppet on a string." He said he wished he could walk around Tupelo without being mobbed by fans. He then asked if I would come work for him, just to be a companion. I said no because I had a good life in Tupelo and didn't want to leave my wife. He seemed disappointed, but maybe also relieved. That was the last time I saw Elvis. Elvis was generous, giving away cars and money like it was nothing. But despite all his fame, he was still that poor, unhappy boy from East Tupelo, trapped in a world he couldn't control. Many people claim to have known him, but I never tried to capitalize on our friendship. Just being his friend was enough for me. Thinking about Elvis's life, I often wonder what it would have been like if things had turned out differently. If Gladys had bought him a rifle instead of a guitar, would his life have been different? I remember those carefree days when we ran wild in the streets of Old South Tupelo. Those memories are the most precious to me. Elvis's family was small, which was unusual. His parents, Vernon and Gladys, only had one child, Elvis. Even Vernon's brother, Vester, only had one child, and that was 5 years after he married Gladys's sister, Kletz. Some people say Gladys couldn't have more kids because of a difficult birth or a miscarriage, but Vernon said they tried and consulted doctors. There was no medical reason, but they never had more children. Vernon said that when Elvis was about 10, he realized Elvis would be their only child. He called Elvis a special gift who would fill their lives completely. But I always wondered if there was more to the story. Maybe Vernon couldn't have children. This idea came up again when Vernon married Dee Stanley after Gladys died. Dee really wanted to have a child with Vernon, but it never happened. She even had Vernon get circumcised, thinking that might help, but it didn't. When Dee finally got pregnant, Vernon was jealous and asked, "Well, that's fine, Dee, who does it belong to?" Later, Dee told me that Vernon admitted he couldn't have children. If this is true, it changes a lot about Elvis's story. It means Elvis might not have been Vernon's biological son. This is just one more piece of the puzzle in Elvis's life, and it shows that the truth is often more complex than we think. For over 30 years, I've been digging into the life of Elvis Presley. I've read his letters, studied his actions, and talked to the people who knew him. Despite all this, Elvis still seems like a puzzle I can't fully solve. But I've learned one thing. The least we can do for him is to tell his story truthfully. I remember reading what humorist Dave Barry wrote after visiting Graceland. He said that when you talk to a true Elvis fan, they don't usually talk about his music or his talent. Instead, they talk about how he seemed to be looking at them, singing to them. They believe that Elvis loved them, just as much as they loved him. They talk about how much he cared for them, how much he gave them, and how, in a way, he died for them. But how can we love a legend without loving the real person behind it? I think what Dave Barry wrote is true for the typical fan, the kind who gets swept up in the image and the emotion. The true fan, though, wants to know more. They want to understand the man behind the mask, the details, the nitty-gritty, the humanity. The problem is, Elvis is a man of many mysteries. There are so many cover-ups, lies, and PR distortions that it's hard to know what's real and what's not. In this book, I've tried to clear up some of these mysteries and correct a lot of the confusion. We've identified the missing fathers of Elvis's great-uncles, traced his family's immigration to America, and debunked the myths about his Cherokee heritage and Jewish ancestry. We've also found the real story of where he was born, located important sites and graves, and corrected a lot of errors in previous biographies. But as we dug deeper, we found new mysteries that we couldn't solve. For example, we have strong evidence that Vernon Presley might not have been Elvis's biological father, but we need a DNA sample to prove it. We also have clues that Gladys Presley might have been an illegitimate daughter, but we need more DNA to confirm that too. We've connected many new people to Elvis's family tree, but there are still many more questions. To help solve these mysteries, we started the Elvis DNA Project. We have a database with over 100 DNA samples from every major branch of Elvis's family, and an interactive family tree with about 40,000 names. We can identify family members and their relationships to Elvis. If you think you might be related to Elvis, you can donate a DNA sample. We use a variety of genetic labs and don't charge for processing or analysis. We can even sign a non-disclosure agreement to keep your results private. The Smith branch of Elvis's family tree starts with George Smith, who came from England in the 1670s. He had a son named Josiah, who had a son named George. This second George had a son named Thomas, who had a son named Thomas Jr. Thomas Jr. had a son named Mileage Obadiah Smith, who had a son named Robert Lee Smith. Robert Lee Smith married Doll Mansell, and they had a daughter named Gladys Love Smith, who became Elvis's mother. The Mansell branch starts with Edward Mansfield, who was born in Wales. His son, Capt. David Mansell, came to America with his wife, Lucy. They had a son named Samuel Jr., who had a son named George Norwood Mansell. George married Sarah Garrett, and they had a son named Samuel Mansell. This Samuel was a soldier in the Revolutionary War, and had a son named Robert John Mansell. Robert had a son named James William Mansell, who had a son named Edward Green Mansell. Edward moved to Alabama and had a son named William A. Mansell. William married Jane Ellender Egger and had a son named John B. Mansell. John married Elizabeth Gilmore, and they had 2 children, White Mansell and Anna White. Mansell married Martha Tackett and had a daughter named Doll Mansell. Anna married Mileage Obadiah Smith and had a son named Robert Lee Smith. Doll and Robert Lee Smith had a daughter named Gladys Love Smith, who became Elvis's mother. The Gilmore branch starts with Hugh Gilmore, who came from Ireland. He had a son named John Gilmore, who had a son named John Joyner Gilmore. John Joyner had a son named John B. Mansell, who married Elizabeth Gilmore. They had 2 children, White Mansell and Anna, who both ended up in Elvis's family tree. All these branches come together to form the roots of Elvis. Understanding these roots helps us understand the man behind the legend. So if you have any information or DNA that might help, please reach out to us. Every piece of the puzzle brings us closer to the real Elvis Presley. I remember the day clearly. It was a sunny morning in Tupelo, and I was with Julian Riley, a local who knew more about Elvis Presley's hometown than anyone I'd ever met. We were walking through the old neighborhoods, the ones where Elvis and his family lived when he was just a kid. Julian pointed out the places that shaped Elvis's early life, like the Tupelo garment factory where Gladys worked, and the home on Maple Street where Elvis started first grade. We talked about the people who signed the petition to get Vernon Presley out of Parchman Prison, and how many of them were just neighbors and friends, not even family. Julian told me about the first Presley who came to America, Andrew David Preslar, and how he changed his name to Presley. He shared stories of the Hoods, the Wallaces, and the Tacketts, all part of the big, complicated family tree that led to Elvis. We visited the Ledyard School where Elvis started his education and the fairgrounds where he performed his homecoming concert, a moment that brought the whole town together. Julian's knowledge and passion for the truth about Elvis's roots were contagious. He helped me understand that Elvis wasn't just a famous singer. He was a kid from Tupelo who had a family history as rich and varied as the land he came from. Julian's persistence in correcting the myths and errors about Elvis's past was what made this book possible. He showed me that every detail, no matter how small, mattered in telling the real story. I couldn't have done this without Ian Graham Leask, my partner at Calumet Editions. His editing and support made this book better, and gave me the courage to dig deep into the mess of myth surrounding Elvis. Rick Pauled, Beth Williams, and Joshua Weber also played crucial roles, making sure the book was polished and error-free. I also want to thank McKay Hargett for his stories and photographs, and for helping Julian solve one of the biggest mysteries in Elvis's origin story. The countless others who shared their thoughts and information about Elvis and his hometown made this journey possible. Writing this book was a journey through time, a way to connect with the past and understand the person behind the legend. It's not just about Elvis, it's about the people and places that made him who he was. I hope that by reading this, you'll feel a little closer to the real Elvis Presley, the boy from Tupelo who became a global icon.